This is part 2 of the Amityville book series overview from Pulp Arcanum. 5 years after the global success reaped from the initial novel, the Lutzes once again went down the avenue of publishing to expound on their horror story. It's indicated that they were outlanders on the financial side of both the book and movie as a result of their naivety of the business. After the death of the original writer Jay Anson, which is covered in part 1 of this series in 1980, they were in need of a new writer after struggling to get their next book together. At a cocktail party, they met and had an immediate connection with John G. Jones, an Australian rock star that moved to the States to further his musical career. According to his website, Amityville Now, the Lutzes insisted that he write their next book. The terrifying sequel to the most frightening true-life horror story of recent times, The Amityville Horror Part 2, The Terror Continues, was released by Warner Books in January 1982. The novel comes with a disclaimer that this book is a work of fiction. The story picks up in the immediate aftermath of them fleeing 112 Ocean Avenue and carries us on to the late 70s and the release of the movie. In the opening, the Lutz's narrative was a fashioned mishmash of film and original in order for it to dovetail into a series. The opening prologue recaps the DeFeo murder mystery, psychic's involvement, the DeFeo father, and others who have experienced the horror curses, including the Unsealed Well, Jack Ketchum, and the Indian Burial Ground. In the book, it says the Lutzes left behind $40,000 in antiques, a boat, furniture, including the house deed, written in constant cooperation with the Lutzes. It also declares certain bits of info and events have been altered for consolidation and effect reasons. This is the first novel written by John G. Jones, and is much similar to the chronicled narrative style of Jay Anson. The family is able to flee in the van, almost toppled over by a gust of wind. The van is nearly crushed. They arrive at Kathy's mom's house in Babylon, New York, and meditate in bed. George encounters swarms of flies outside of the kitchen window, but nothing amounts to it. Amy, the daughter, starts talking to the ghost Jody again. Kathy realizes that the horror has followed them. The most vicious monster encountered happens early on when George slays a fire demon in Kathy's mom's basement with water. It's similar to the monster Balrog in Lord of the Rings. They reconnect with the priest, Father Mancuso, from the original, for his guidance. At a pizzeria in Amityville, George meets up with Davies and Harding, two ghost-hunting demonologists, as well as a reporter. George refuses to tell them about the house. Instead, he offers them access, and he freaks out and leaves the pizzeria. He's experiencing constant headaches, just like in the first, and also other frights. Similar to her cronish transformation from the original, a gnarled death-faced Kathy attacks George before he's able to subdue her, and she transforms back. The reporter, as well as the paranormal researchers, enter the house, where Xmas decorations are still up. They encounter the Red Room, and John cowers from a black mass engulfing him. It is still haunted. Harry the dog, who is miraculously saved at the end of the first one, goes rabid at the new house and ends up mauling a tree, and nail claws clip George and cause it to bleed. Much of the hauntings that occur in the book appear transitory and superficial. George meets up with Father Mancuso at a Chinese restaurant and convinces him to move far away to run away from the horror. George gives the house back to the bank, and the family business is sold, and they move to San Diego. They leave all their possessions behind, and George struggles to find employment. However, they did bring one chest from Amityville, and they believe that spawned an all-new haunting. A swarm of flies appears in the kitchen tile. The kids play a secondary role in this one compared to the first one. Amy starts seeing Jody again, however. Jody hitched a ride on the wing of the plane, according to Amy, the young dog. One of the more intriguing angles in this book is the account of how the original novel came about. According to George, J. Anson works out a deal with the publisher Princeton Hall. Anson was most interested in securing the movie rights, book rights, instead of interviewing George about the account. This comes off as passive-aggressive. They receive an advance copy of the Amityville Horror coming in the mail in Southern California. George and Kathy are surprised at the amount of Father Mancuso's role in this. At this point, we're about halfway through the book. George decides to go on a promotional book tour, doing interviews all over the country, including Europe. Struggling to find work in his profession and the loss of the house and his business, George reluctantly goes on these tours and ends up being the butt of many jokes because they're in need of the money. They berate and denigrate him, often comparing his account to that of UFOs. Now enter the next monster, the rattlesnake, which first attacks the boys in Back Ravine. It didn't bite them, they actually warded it off with a rock. This rattlesnake is featured in the Step Back art, shown attacking the priest, but at this point Mancuso himself moves to the west coast, but to the north part in Portland, to attend to his own cathedral there. Familiar ailments returned to the Lutzes, including headaches and body aches for them both, and the same putrescent stench followed them from Amityville. Having returned home from the book tour, George takes a ride on his motorcycle and ends up being attacked by the same rattlesnake, well, presumably the same rattlesnake, while riding. At the hospital, there's no wound. Apparently, his St. Michael pendant, gifted to him by Father Mancuso, blocked the venomous bite. Both George and Kathy are plagued by numerous nightmares featuring Jody the pig. Kathy ends up joining George in the book tour as they travel to Europe, specifically Amsterdam, where they're heckled by a crowd. Meanwhile, back in California, one of the most absurd things in the book happens. The boys are swimming in the ocean, being watched by a babysitter, when one of them almost drowns before he's saved by Archangel Michael, acting as a Good Samaritan anonymous lifeguard, and pulls him out of the ocean before exiting. This brings us to 1979, where the movie release is imminent. Billboards are all up around Southern California. The Lutzes move again to another suburb of San Diego. They are hired as technical advisors for the movie. The studio has them undergo lie detector tests to coincide with the movie's release, and more press tours to hype up the film. People associated in administering the lie detector tests ended up having eerie emotions following their meeting with the Lutzes, including waking up at 3:15 a.m. In the book's finale, the Lutzes are once again in Europe on a tour for Pan Publishing when they link up with a renowned exorcist named Reverend Johnstone, who successfully performs an exorcism for them in their cathedral. All in all, the novel is extremely vapid and prosaic. The absence of the house is evident. It sucks a lot of the horror out of the story. The meat of the horror emanates from it. We never get a follow-up from the psychics or the reporter on the house, or any updates past the opening few chapters. The inexperience of writer John G. Jones is numbing to the reader as he fails to hook you in with suspense. Nonetheless, the book went on to sell over 1 million copies. Coming up in part 3 of the Amityville Horror book series overview. Not all the demons have been exorcised as the horror returns in the most terrifying true story of our time, Amityville, the final chapter. This has been a Pulp Arcanum segment. I'm JBM. To listen to the full podcast, search for it on podcasting apps.